It's really important that leaders figure out how to disrupt bias in the moment. Because we as human beings, we are pattern makers. And that is part of what creates bias, is a bad pattern. So if we don't disrupt a bad pattern, then we will get more of it. And we want to reinforce the good pattern. So it's not public criticism to disrupt bias in the moment.
Hi, and welcome to the BetterWorks People Fundamentals podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Litzenberger, Senior Director of Product Marketing. BetterWorks' core belief in people fundamentals revolves around helping HR lead through constant change by focusing on core values like fairness, support, balance, and enabling growth opportunities for employees. These tenets empower everyone in the workforce to strive for excellence, to foster creativity, and to acknowledge each other's contributions. BetterWorks believes that strategic HR leaders can translate these principles into action, shaping their workforce for the better and helping drive meaningful business outcomes. We're excited to bring you a conversation adapted from a recent People Fundamentals webinar, where we had the pleasure of chatting with Kim Scott. Kim is the New York Times bestselling author of Radical Respect and Radical Candor, and she's coached CEOs at big-name tech companies like Dropbox, Qualtrics, and Twitter. She's also learned a lot from her own experiences as a co-founder and CEO of 2 startups, lessons she draws on in our conversation today. In this episode, Kim talks about how to build better team dynamics and trust by addressing some of the tough but important issues: bias, prejudice, and bullying. She breaks down what each of these looks like and explains how they're different. She also shares some really practical tips on how leaders and teams can handle them effectively. Whether it's creating a shared language to call out bias or setting clear boundaries against bullying, Kim's insights are all about fostering respect and inclusivity in the workplace. So sit back and get ready to learn from one of the best in the business as Kim walks us through how to create a culture of respect that helps everyone thrive. Kim's journey to defining radical respect began with some eye-opening feedback from a colleague that underscored how tough it can be to create a truly respectful culture. Radical respect is about actively recognizing and addressing behaviors that undermine trust and collaboration in the workplace. Through this experience, Kim uncovered key lessons on how to spot where we're falling short and what steps we can take to better support our teams. After realizing how often we can miss opportunities to stand up for others, Kim shifts the focus to what really gets in the way of creating a culture of respect. She breaks down how bias, prejudice, and bullying can play a distinct role in hindering respectful interactions.
So what gets in the way of radical respect? There's a million things, but I'm going to boil it down to 3: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think very often we conflate these 3 things as though they're the same thing. But in fact, they're 3 very different things. The problem with conflating different problems is that then the problem becomes like a monolithic hairball. It feels impossible to disentangle it and solve it. So let's break it apart. I'm going to offer some overly simple definitions just so we can distinguish between them in the moment. Bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. I'm really talking about unconscious bias. Whereas prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying is just being mean. It's not about any belief, conscious or unconscious. And so what can you say when you notice these things? What to say when you don't know what to say? In the case of bias, I recommend an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. One of my favorite stories about this comes from a colleague, a guy I know, who was going into a meeting with a big team, and his team was very small. And the woman on his team who had the expertise that was going to win his team the deal sat in the center of this big, long conference table. He sat to her left, and then the other guy on their team sat to his left. And then when the other side came in, the first person sat across from him, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. Anybody ever notice bias showing up in that way? Just who decides to sit next to whom? And she started talking, And when the other side had a question, they didn't direct them at her. They directed them at him or his colleague. Anybody ever notice bias show up in that way? Kind of awkward. It happened once. It happened twice. It happened a third time. And finally, he stood up and he said, I think we should switch seats. That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. As soon as he said that and they switched seats, the other side realized what they were doing and they stopped doing it. They hadn't intended to exclude her or ignore her. And why did he do it? Why did he decide to be an abstainer in that moment? First of all, there's a practical reason. He wanted to win the deal, and he knew that if he couldn't get them listening to her, they wouldn't win the deal. Second of all, he liked her, and it bothered him to see her get ignored. So there's sort of an emotional, almost an ethical reason to do it. Third of all, he had some compassion for the people who were doing this to her because he knew he had made that cut. We all have our unconscious biases, and he knew it would be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. And fourthly, there was some sort of enlightened self-interest. He realized if he didn't do it, he would have one of those moments where he's waking up at 3 a.m, kicking himself, wondering why he didn't intervene. So that is such a simple story, and yet it's rare.
When it comes to prejudice, she explains the importance of using an it statement to set clear boundaries. Kim shares a personal story that illustrates how confronting prejudice with firm, respectful communication can prevent it from disrupting workplace relationships.
Now, what if it is prejudice? An I statement sort of holds up a mirror. And if the issue is prejudice, then that's not going to work because the person's going to smile in that mirror. They're going to like what they see. They really do believe that thing. So in case of prejudice, you want an it statement. An it statement draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they cannot impose those beliefs on others. An example of this comes from my career. This happened shortly after I had returned to work after parental leave. I had twins. I'd taken 5 months off, and this was my second day back in the office. And I was having all the feelings that one often has in such a moment. And I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said to me, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And for me at this moment, that was like a gut punch because I was already having all these guilty feelings. But I didn't think he meant that quite the way it sounded. I would sort of at first assumed it was unconscious bias. And I said, I tried to make a joke of it. I said, I decided to show up at work today because I thought it'd be a good idea to neglect my children. And I was expecting him to laugh and apologize and we would move on. But that's not what happened. He doubled down. He said, "Oh no, Kim, you really shouldn't have come back to work. It's really bad for your kids. I've got all this research. I'm going to send it to you." And so now I know it's not unconscious bias. It's a very consciously held prejudice. And so I decided I needed an it statement. I started out by appealing to a company policy. And I said, "Look, it is an HR violation for you to tell me I'm neglecting my kids by showing up at work today." And that had the desired impact. He kind of backed off. And that's, by the way, why these policies are important, because it gives you, it lets everybody know where that boundary is. But I knew that I needed to work with him, and I didn't think it would help. I needed to engage with him. I didn't want to over delegate to HR. And so I said to him, "Look, I'm not gonna make a big thing of this, but it is my decision." Now I'm going to use an it statement that appeals to common sense. "It is my decision, together with my spouse, how we raise our kids, just as it is your decision, together with yours, how you raise your children. And luckily, you and I are not raising children together. We're selling services." And so he kind of laughed, but I could tell I hadn't really gotten through to him. And I was a little bit worried that if I didn't get through, if I didn't make this super clear, that he would decide that I shouldn't work with customers, for example, who are out of town. He would decide I shouldn't travel. And I didn't want him to do that. So I said, "Look, It's my guess, I'm going to try it again, appealing to common sense. It's my guess that you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research. And then he kind of laughed and we moved on. We didn't have to agree about this in order to work well together. So and it was important to me that I said something, because if I had said nothing, we would not have been able to work well together, because I would have been resentful.
Kim explains that a typical response like I statements often don't work with bullies who tend to push boundaries. Instead, Kim suggests using you statements to take an active stance and deflect the bully's behavior.
All right, last but not least, bullying. What's the best way to respond to bullying? An it statement is not going to work, because as soon as you show someone who is in bullying mode where a boundary is, you can be sure they're going to try to kick past it. And an I statement is also not, it can feel actually quite risky, because an I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. And what you're trying to do with bullying is sort of push them away. So if it's bullying, I recommend a you statement or a you response. I learned this from my daughter when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I made a mistake that I think a lot of parents make. And I said to her, well, tell this kid I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. She banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? I'm like, oh, that's a really good point. And so we talked about it. We realized a you response would be better. Sort of, you can't talk to me like that, or you can't do that. Or even sort of just a you question, like, what's going on for you here? Why are you doing this? Or even if either one of those felt like they might escalate the situation, you could just use a you non sequitur, like, where'd you get that shirt? The point of the use of the you response is that you're not now addressing whatever it is they just dished out at you. You're in an active stance and you're asking them to respond to you. So you're not passively accepting, because what you don't want to do in the case of bullying is passively accept it. So I'm not saying this is going to solve all of the world's problems, but this is the basic framework that has helped me when I'm in that moment and I'm cringing and I'm trying to figure out what to say in response to something. Quickly think, do I think it was bias? Do I think it was prejudice? Do I think it was bullying? And then say the word I, and something else will come out of my mouth. Or if it's prejudice, start with the word it, and then something else will come out of my mouth. If I think it's bullying, start with the word you, and something else will come out of my mouth. This is a momentum game. And you don't have to be 100% sure about whether it's bias, prejudice, or bullying. You can, start, if you think it's bias, like in the case of the parental leave story, start with the word I, and you'll learn what it is.
Kim emphasizes that everyone has a role to play in tackling disrespectful behavior, not just leaders. She explains that while leaders are crucial in disrupting bias and setting boundaries against prejudice, they can't do it alone. Kim also shares strategies for leaders to intervene effectively, create spaces for conversations, and ensure that there are clear consequences. This reinforces the importance of collective responsibility.
What are some things you can do if you notice bias, prejudice, or bullying, or other forms of disrespect? I think one important thing to say here is that we all have a role to play. Leaders have a really important role to play, and I'll start with what leaders can do. But leaders cannot solve these problems alone. We all have an important role to play. So what can leaders do about disrespectful attitudes and behaviors? I think that when it comes to bias, it's really important that leaders figure out how to disrupt bias in the moment. Because we as human beings, we are pattern makers. And that is part of what creates bias, is a bad pattern. So if we don't disrupt a bad pattern, then we will get more of it. And we want to reinforce the good pattern. So it's not public criticism to disrupt bias in the moment. And I'll talk in a second about how to do more of that. And when it comes to prejudice, I say that an it statement sort of draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose their belief on others. But where that line is going to vary. I can't give you a perfect description of where it always ought to be. It's going to vary team to team. And so what I recommend is that you create a space for conversation so that people understand what the law is, they understand what the company policies are, and they have kind of a common sense understanding of where that line is. And last but not least, in the face of bullying, it's essential that leaders create consequences for bullying.
Kim continues by highlighting specific actions that leaders can take to help their teams recognize and disrupt bias. She suggests creating a shared vocabulary to gently call out bias when it happens. Kim also stresses the importance of teaching teams to respond thoughtfully when their biases are pointed out, and leaders can set clear consequences to prevent and address bullying.
I think there are 3 things you can do as a leader to teach your team to disrupt bias. One thing is to come up with a shared vocabulary. I like to wave a purple flag. So if I say or do something biased, or if I notice bias, I'll wave a purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not a yellow flag. It's not a red flag. But other teams I've worked with have thought that they don't like the purple flag. Some teams will use a nice statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. One team I worked with would throw up a peace sign. Another team had kind of a cat theme going on. They would meow at each other. Whatever it is, talk to your team and figure out what's the word or phrase that they can agree to use so that everyone understands, all right, that was bias. We're just flagging it. Now, the next thing you need to do as a leader is to help teach your team to respond well when their bias has been disrupted. Because I don't know about you all, but for me, when someone tells me that I've said or done something that's biased, I feel deeply ashamed. And like all people, when I am in shame brain, my executive function shuts down and I have this sort of instinctive lizard brain response. And that is rarely my best response. So help people learn to say when someone points out to them that they've said or done something biased, which we are all bound to do. Help people learn rather than to deny it, to say, thank you for pointing it out. Either I get it and I'm working on not doing it. And it may take a while. Often these biased patterns of speech are deeply ingrained patterns of speech. And it takes a long time to change those deeply ingrained patterns. So either say, I get it, or I don't get it. Now, this is really hard. When this has happened to me, I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've hurt someone else, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. And yet, this is going to happen to all of us. So let's take shame out of the game and just normalize the fact that we all have biases, and a lot of them, when they're pointed out, we don't even know what's wrong. And so we need to learn. We need to be open to learning together. And last but not least, a leader needs to create a shared commitment on the team to embrace the discomfort. It's uncomfortable to wave the purple flag and to build stamina to have these kinds of conversations. Now, what can leaders do about bullying? There are 3 different kinds of consequences that leaders need to create for bullying. The first is conversational consequences. You want to teach yourself as well as your team to use that you statement or that you response. What's going on for you here? This doesn't sound like you. You want to make sure that people have equal airtime. When you are a leader and you're hosting a meeting, you want to make sure that you deplatform bullies in the moment. You also need to create compensation consequences. You want to make sure that people know that bullying is disqualifying for getting a high rating or a bonus. If you give a big bonus to someone who bullies others, that bullying is just going to escalate. It's going to get worse. You're rewarding bad behavior. Last but not least, career consequences. If someone bullies others, the last thing you want to do is to promote them. There comes a moment on too many teams when the jerks begin to win. And that is the moment when the team's culture begins to lose. So if you've got someone on your team who's bullying others, whatever you do, not promote them. In fact, what you want to do is you want to give them some feedback that lets them know that this behavior is preventing them from growing in their career. And in fact, if they can't change that behavior, they're going to get fired because it's better to have a hole than an asshole.
Kim says that it's our responsibility to become an upstander, someone who steps in rather than staying silent when witnessing disrespect. She offers practical ways to intervene, whether by directly addressing the situation, checking in with the person harmed, or even creating a distraction to diffuse the moment.
It's not all on the leaders. Let's also talk about what upstanders can and must do. It is the obligation of an upstander to intervene. You don't want to be a silent bystander who ignores. So what can upstanders, how can they intervene? One example is to intervene directly, like the guy who said, I think we should switch seats. But that's not always going to work. Sometimes you can't think of what to say, or you might be concerned that's just going to make the situation worse. You can also delay. You could just check in with the person who was harmed. This can dispel gaslighting and be so important. An example of why this matters comes from another story in my career. I was giving a talk to a big team, like 5,000 people, and the leader of that team was introducing my team and me as we were going on stage. He introduced my first colleague, shook his hand, introduced my second colleague, shook his hand, introduced me. I stuck my hand out for him to shake it, and he grabbed it and he kissed it, kind of leaving spit on the back of my hand. So that was gross. So it's not the end of the world, but it was a little gross, not what I was hoping. The thing, though, that was even worse than what he did was the fact that not one of those 5,000 people came up to me afterwards and said, that was kind of weird. Do you want some hand sanitizer? Or any acknowledgement of what happened. And then I started to feel gaslit. I started to feel like, am I making too big of a deal of that? Was that not as weird as I thought? So it really can help the person harmed feel like they have some solidarity in the situation if you check in with them afterwards. And that's what I mean by delay. Just check in with the person who was harmed afterwards. You can also create a distraction. Sometimes just spilling your cup of coffee can give everybody a chance to sort of change the script a little bit. You can also delegate. None of us want to be the silent bystander, but we've all been in situations where a bunch of people notice something and nobody says anything, and then it becomes almost uncomfortable to say something. So if you don't feel like you're the right person to say something, catch someone else's eye and sort of ask them to say something. Last but not least, you can document. We're all carrying around these movie cameras in our pockets. But remember, if you document what happened, it's the person who's harmed who owns that documentation. Don't just go post it on social media, but offer it to them and ask them how you can be most helpful.
She shares her personal struggle with this and emphasizes the importance of adopting a growth mindset. Kim outlines how to genuinely take responsibility and work towards meaningful improvement. She reminds us that when we're the ones harmed, we have the power to choose how to respond, highlighting the importance of making that choice consciously rather than defaulting to silence.
Now, what can you do if you get some feedback that you're the person who caused harm? For me, this was the hardest part of the book to write because I so do not see myself as a disrespectful person. I so want to be a good leader, a good upstander. And yet it was really important to me to adopt a growth mindset. As my son's baseball coach said to the kids, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong. And so we've got to be open to the feedback when we're the ones who actually were disrespectful. One of the things that I try to do is to use this ACK acronym when I get this kind of feedback. So what does ACK stand for? That's 5 A's and a C's. First of all, be aware. I try to remember that it's my responsibility to be aware when I am the person who caused harm. It's not somebody else's responsibility to give me the feedback even or to educate me. I'm responsible for my own education. So I try to be aware. And it's not actually our instinct to be aware when we get feedback that we've harmed someone else. Jennifer Fried, who's a psychologist, coined a term for what is instinctive for most of us to do, and it's called DARVO: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. Do not do that. Try to be aware, and then to acknowledge what you did wrong, and then to accept the consequences. If you Google DARVO South Park, there's an excellent explanation of it. So you want to accept the consequences. Then you want to make amends. You want to go beyond what you're required to do and to really show this person that you are sorry and that you're not just sorry, but that you're willing to make it right. And only after you do those things does your apology have much meaning. And then, of course, you've got to work on changing. If you keep making the same mistake over and over, your apology becomes kind of an irritant. So if you get feedback, you've caused harm, try to act, try not to DARVO. I just wrote a post about this yesterday. Last but not least, what do you do if you're the person who's harmed? And every one of us feels disrespected from time to time. I don't think anybody has never experienced disrespect. So what do you do if you are the target of the bias, prejudice, and bullying? I think the important thing here is to remember that if you're harmed, you get to choose a response. You don't have to respond. I think sometimes we sort of add insult to injury by kicking ourselves. I didn't say anything, I didn't have the courage. And it's not about courage. Sometimes you're just exhausted. Sometimes it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. You've heard the same damn thing said to you over and over and over again, and you're sick of having this conversation. And you get to choose not to respond. But make sure this is a very active choice. If you just default to silence, then you can, at least I have found in my career, that I lose a sense of agency. So try to take an extra beat to calculate the return on investment of speaking up. There's a risk of speaking up. I want to acknowledge that. But there's also a risk of remaining silent. And we tend to be more instinctively aware of the risks of speaking up. And so we need to take a moment and think about what are the risks of remaining silent so that we can make a conscious choice and not default to silence.
As we wrap up today's chat about building better team dynamics and fostering trust, let's take a minute to think about how you can start to apply these ideas in your own workplace. First, tackle bias head on. As Kim mentioned, bias often happens unconsciously, but it can affect how teams work together. Encourage your team to come up with a shared way to point out and disrupt bias as it happens. This not only helps make your workplace more inclusive, but also builds stronger trust among everyone. Second, set clear boundaries against prejudice. Kim highlighted the power of using it statements to make sure people understand that certain beliefs, even if personal, shouldn't be imposed on others at work. Create spaces for open conversation and make sure everyone knows company policies can help everyone stay on the same page. Lastly, don't tolerate bullying in any form. Bullying can be really harmful to a team's culture, and as Kim pointed out, it's important for leaders to establish clear consequences for this behavior. Whether it's through direct conversations, adjustments in compensation, or even career impacts, address bullying directly to maintain a respectful and supportive work environment. Building a workplace that's respectful and inclusive is a journey, and it takes everyone's effort. By addressing bias, setting clear boundaries against prejudice, and standing up against bullying, you can help create an environment where everyone feels valued and empowered to do their best work. Don't forget to catch our next episode of the People Fundamentals podcast. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music. And if you're enjoying the show, share it with your friends or your colleagues. We'll see you again next time.